Southeast Asia has once again stepped back from the edge of conflict after months of rising tensions between Thailand and Cambodia threatened to destabilize the region. What makes this moment remarkable is not only the fragile peace that now exists, but also the quiet diplomatic effort that helped prevent the situation from spiraling further. At the center of that effort was Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who used behind-the-scenes diplomacy during the ASEAN Summit in Cebu to bring both sides back to the negotiating table. The border dispute between Thailand and Cambodia is not new. In fact, it has existed for decades, rooted in disagreements over territory and old colonial-era maps. But in 2025, the conflict suddenly became far more dangerous. Armed clashes erupted near disputed areas along the border, and what initially appeared to be a localized military confrontation quickly escalated into artillery exchanges, troop buildups, and air operations. The fighting forced thousands of civilians to flee their homes. Border communities were disrupted, trade routes slowed down, and fears grew that the conflict could spread into a much larger regional crisis. For ASEAN, the situation became one of the biggest diplomatic challenges the organization had faced in years. Even after ceasefire agreements were announced, tensions between Bangkok and Phnom Penh remained extremely fragile. Troops stayed stationed near disputed zones. Accusations continued from both sides, and trust had almost completely collapsed. That is where the Philippines stepped in. As ASEAN chair for 2026, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. quietly initiated efforts to reduce tensions between the two neighboring countries. Rather than using aggressive public diplomacy, the Philippine government focused on creating an environment where both leaders could speak directly and privately. During the ASEAN Summit in Cebu, Marcos hosted a rare trilateral meeting involving Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet and Thai Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul. The talks were held quietly on the sidelines of the summit, but diplomats quickly understood how important the meeting actually was. Direct communication between Thailand and Cambodia had become increasingly difficult after the border clashes, making the Cebu talks one of the first major opportunities for both sides to sit together in a calmer setting. The Philippines described the meeting as part of ASEAN's responsibility to preserve peace and stability within the region. This meeting was arranged by the Philippines as a way to provide its good offices in our capacity as chair of ASEAN for 2026, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said. The statement reflected ASEAN's traditional diplomatic style. Instead of forcing solutions, the organization prefers dialogue, mediation, and gradual confidence building between member states. And in this case, that approach appeared to work. According to regional officials, the talks focused on maintaining the ceasefire, reducing military tensions, and rebuilding trust between both governments. Leaders also discussed ways to prevent accidental clashes along the border and agreed to continue communication through diplomatic channels. The atmosphere after the meeting was noticeably more positive. Thai Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul acknowledged that rebuilding relations would take time, but emphasized that both countries needed to move forward carefully and peacefully. Thailand and Cambodia must move forward together, step by step, in the same direction, Anutin Charnvirakul said. He also made clear that another military confrontation would benefit no one. It is best that we avoid conflict. It only brings losses and suffering, Anutin Charnvirakul said. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet likewise signaled support for peaceful negotiations and diplomatic engagement. Cambodian officials welcomed ASEAN's role in helping calm the situation and stressed the importance of maintaining regional stability. While the headlines surrounding the Cebu meeting were relatively modest, diplomats privately viewed the talks as a major breakthrough. The reason is simple. Just months earlier, the relationship between Thailand and Cambodia had deteriorated to one of the worst points in recent history. The origins of the dispute go back more than a century. The border between Thailand and Cambodia stretches over 800 kilometers and has long been disputed because of unclear demarcation lines created during the colonial period. One of the most sensitive areas involves land surrounding the ancient Priya Vihar temple, a centuries-old Hindu temple located near the border. Although the International Court of Justice ruled in Cambodia's favor decades ago, disagreements over nearby territory never fully disappeared. Over the years, tensions have repeatedly resurfaced, sometimes leading to military standoffs and brief armed clashes. But the 2025 crisis was especially dangerous. The conflict reportedly began after a confrontation involving soldiers from both sides near disputed territory. Thailand and Cambodia each accused the other of violating sovereignty and opening fire first. Within days, the situation escalated dramatically. Heavy artillery exchanges were reported along parts of the border. Thailand deployed fighter aircraft, while Cambodia appealed for international support and raised concerns before the United Nations. As the fighting intensified, civilians living near the frontier became trapped in the middle of the violence. Entire communities were forced to evacuate. Schools closed, businesses stopped operating, and cross-border trade suffered major disruptions. Regional leaders grew increasingly worried that prolonged fighting could damage Southeast Asia's economic stability and weaken ASEAN's credibility. Malaysia, which chaired ASEAN in 2025, helped broker an initial ceasefire agreement. However, tensions remained unstable throughout the year, and there were repeated fears that another incident could restart the fighting. When the Philippines assumed the ASEAN chairmanship in 2026, the unresolved border crisis became one of the region's most urgent diplomatic concerns. For Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the issue represented more than just a bilateral dispute between two neighboring countries. It also became a test of whether ASEAN could still function as an effective diplomatic platform during times of regional crisis. Throughout the summit, Marcos emphasized unity, dialogue, and peaceful dispute resolution as core ASEAN principles. This meeting has demonstrated how our relationship in ASEAN is built on mutual respect, trust, solidarity, and understanding, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said. Behind closed doors, ASEAN diplomats reportedly worked carefully to avoid inflaming nationalist sentiments inside both Thailand and Cambodia. That strategy mattered. Border disputes are politically sensitive issues in both countries, and leaders on both sides face domestic pressure not to appear weak on territorial claims. Publicly aggressive negotiations could have triggered political backlash at home. That is why quiet diplomacy became the preferred approach. Instead of dramatic public announcements, ASEAN leaders focused on reopening communication channels and creating practical confidence-building measures. Among the discussions were proposals to improve military coordination near the border, continue diplomatic negotiations between foreign ministers, and reduce the risk of accidental troop confrontations. ASEAN observers also remained involved in monitoring the fragile ceasefire arrangements established after the 2025 conflict. While the latest talks helped calm immediate tensions, experts caution that the underlying dispute is still unresolved. Troops remain deployed in sensitive border areas, and legal disagreements over territorial claims continue. There are also broader political and economic issues affecting relations between both countries, including dispute as connected to offshore energy cooperation. Still, many regional observers believe the Cebu talks succeeded in accomplishing something extremely important. They reduced the immediate risk of war. For ASEAN, that alone represented a significant achievement. The organization has faced criticism in recent years for struggling to manage regional crises effectively, particularly regarding the ongoing civil conflict in Myanmar. Some critics argued that ASEAN had become too slow, too divided, and too cautious to respond decisively during emergencies. The successful mediation between Thailand and Cambodia therefore provided an opportunity for ASEAN to demonstrate that quiet regional diplomacy could still produce results. The Philippines also benefited diplomatically from the process. Under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Manila has attempted to play a more active role in regional affairs. Much global attention on the Philippines has focused on tensions in the South China Sea, where Manila continues to pressure from China over maritime disputes. But at the same time, the Marcos administration has worked to strengthen ties within ASEAN and position the Philippines as a stabilizing diplomatic actor in Southeast Asia. Hosting the Thailand Cambodia talks fit directly into that strategy. Although no final peace agreement emerged from the Cebu meeting, the fact that both leaders agreed to sit together publicly and commit to continued dialogue sent an important message across the region. It showed that diplomacy had replaced immediate confrontation. And, perhaps most importantly, it showed that ASEAN leaders still understood the dangers of allowing internal disputes to spiral out of control. The humanitarian consequences of the 2025 conflict remain fresh in the minds of many people living near the border. Families displaced by the fighting are still recovering. Local economies remain fragile. Businesses that depend on border trade continue facing uncertainty. For ordinary civilians, stability matters far more than political rhetoric. That reality likely added pressure on both governments to avoid another military escalation. Economic concerns also played a major role. Southeast Asia's growth depends heavily on regional stability, trade connectivity, and investor confidence. A prolonged armed conflict between two ASEAN member states would have damaged not only Thailand and Cambodia, but potentially the entire region's economic reputation. That risk made diplomatic de-escalation increasingly urgent. For now, the ceasefire appears to be holding. ASEAN diplomats continue monitoring the situation closely, and both governments have signaled willingness to maintain communication channels moving forward. Whether the current calm eventually leads to a permanent settlement remains uncertain. The Thailand-Cambodia border dispute has survived decades of negotiations, international court rulings, and multiple ceasefires. Historical grievances and territorial disagreements are deep, wide-rooted, making a final resolution extremely difficult. But even temporary stability carries enormous value. Preventing another outbreak of violence saves lives, protects civilians, and preserves regional stability. That is why many observers viewed Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s role so positively. Rather than seeking attention or dramatic headlines, the Philippine president relied on careful diplomacy, quiet mediation, and ASEAN consensus building to reduce tensions between two countries standing dangerously close to renewed conflict. And in today's increasingly unstable world, sometimes preventing a war matters just as much as winning one. As Southeast Asia moves forward, the success of these diplomatic efforts may also shape how ASEAN handles future crises in the future. The Cebu talks demonstrated that even amid deep disagreements and rising nationalism, dialogue remains possible when regional leaders are willing to prioritize stability over confrontation. For Thailand and Cambodia, the road ahead remains uncertain and fragile. But for now, the guns are silent, communication has resumed, and the region has stepped back from the brink. And much of that progress came through quiet diplomacy few people initially noticed happening behind closed doors.